for getting up this morning and coming out to hear me talk about Visual Studio 2010 Extensibility. My name is John Flanders. I work at a company called MCW Technologies. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I do a lot of speaking and a lot of writing and things like that. Some people have said to me, they looked at my schedule of my talks this week and said, wow, you're doing talk on SharePoint, and then you're doing a talk at Visual Studio, and you're doing a talk on App Fabric Cache is my other talk. Not to be pimping my own talks, but those are all sort of three different subjects. Actually, this is the subject that is probably closest to my heart and also the one I have the most experience with. There's a book called MasteringVisualStudio.net, which is actually based upon Visual Studio 2003. And a guy named Chris Sells and Ian Griffith and I wrote this book in 2003. And I still get royalty checks on it, which is kind of amazing. Does anybody still use Visual Studio 2003? Do you? Wow, well, there you go. See, still in use. Not to pimp my book, right, because, only one person here has a potential use for it. Give me your card and I'll send you a free copy. I wrote the chapter in this book. I wrote a couple of chapters, but I wrote the chapter on Visual Studio Extensibility, or also known as the Visual Studio Industry Program, or VSIP, which was the program that you used to have to pay to get in order to get the magic keys to the kingdom to be able to get a hold of the references and the header files and everything to be able to build and extend Visual Studio. This was in, VisualStudio.net 2003. Obviously, we're up to Visual Studio 2010, and that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about what is the extensibility story in Visual Studio 2010, and how can you take advantage of it, and do you have to pay $100,000 in order to get a hold of the COM header files to be able to build something in C++ to plug into Visual Studio? And the quick answer to that is no, right? There's no longer any charge for building things that plug into Visual Studio. Although if you are a ISV, you can join the VSIP program and get extended support and things like that for some amount of money. I don't know how much that is. But the idea behind extensibility in Visual Studio 2010, and the reason that I suggested this as a topic for TechEd, and I was happy that they accepted it, is that extensibility in Visual Studio 2010, in many ways, is not that different than it was in Visual Studio 2003. Those interfaces I referred to that we got the magic header files for and got to be able to use pretty much still exist. So they've built upon earlier versions of Visual Studio to build Visual Studio 2010. In some ways, the ways that you can build extensibility in Visual Studio 2010 are the same ways that you could build extensibility in earlier versions. What's kind of different, though, is it's really much more accessible to the masses. And by that I mean, has anybody in this room ever built a Visual Studio package in earlier versions of Visual Studio? Couple? Was it fun? Did you enjoy it? No, it was not fun. It was not enjoyable. It was hard, right? In fact, it may be, having done it the first time, it was maybe one of the hardest pieces of code I had written up to that point. And even simple things like getting a menu item into Visual Studio from a package was a number of, very sort of esoteric steps on a particular machine. And then getting it to run on somebody else's machine, that's the real magic, right? Of course, that's always the real magic, right? It works on my machine. Will it work on somebody else's machine? I don't know. Let's try it. That's the case with any code. But with the extensibility code, getting all the files in the right place and getting all the assembly references right and all the registry keys right and getting everything lined up on your machine was hard enough. But then trying to package that up and give it to somebody else, that's, again, a whole nother difficult story. So, people who started down that path, if you weren't an ISV, right? If you're not Telerik or Infragistics or any of the guys down in the people down in the expo hall that are building stuff for Visual Studio. I mean, that's their business, right? I'm missing some names of some good people down there. Sorry. Again, early in the morning, I've had my caffeine. It should kick in about 10 minutes or so. But unless you're one of those people, it probably wasn't something that you would attempt, just because there was a large barrier to entry, and the barrier to entry got exponential as you tried to take it from your machine to other people's machines. Just not fun, not a good experience. So what's changed is not the underlying types of extensibility. So we kind of have levels of extensibility from the simple to the complex. So we have macros. Macros are a very simple way of extending Visual Studio and automating Visual Studio. If you wanted to go beyond a macro, you wanted to add a menu item, plug in more to the underlying Visual Studio system, and have something that was more deployable to other people's machines other than a .vb file, which is what a macro is. You could build an add-in. And add-ins actually have never been that difficult. But the problem with add-ins were, and still is to some extent, limited in functionality. So as we go down this road from macros to add-ins to packages, and packages are the basic extensibility point of Visual Studio. Everything in Visual Studio is a package, right? C#, that's a package. VB, that's a package. My former colleague at MCW, Robert Green, is in the audience. Thanks for getting up in the morning to come listen to me blab on, Robert. He works on the Light Switch team. Light Switch, how they plug into Visual Studio, there's a package. So the major extensibility point in Visual Studio up until 2010 has been packages. And again, this is the part that was more difficult to write and more difficult to deploy. What's really changed in 2010 is that the deployment of extensibility artifacts has been greatly simplified, right? Super simplified, in fact. We'll talk about the packaging, but instead of having this thing where you build something and you add all these registry entries and you do all this voodoo magic on your machine to get it to work, and then you've got to build an MSI and you have to be able to write to the registry, to the right keys, and put the assemblies in the right place. Instead of that, you just put everything into a zip file, essentially, pass it around to everybody on your team, or if it's something that you think a lot of people might like, you can upload it to the online gallery. People can download it. You can send it on email and get this file, double-click on it, and Visual Studio installs that extension, puts everything in the right place, boom, right? You've got it. So that's what's really changed. What's really changed in 2010 is that packaging up something that is a Visual Studio extensibility artifact has become much, much easier, right? Super easy, right? And super cool in that now if I build something that is useful to my team, to my company, to people in the community, whomever, right? I can build that, and then I can take it and have a way to deploy it. So people are now building things and uploading to the online gallery, whereas, in earlier versions of Visual Studio, excuse me, people might have done that, but, you probably would have downloaded it from Codeplex or from their own website, and there probably was an MSI, and, there's all sorts of issues, right, with getting things to work on random machines. The simplified deployment, which is called V6, as we'll get into the format of it, is, again, super simple, okay? So same extensibility for the most part, but simplified packaging. Now, I said for the most part, what has changed is that there is some new extensibility features in Visual Studio 2010. The editor is now WPF-based. And into that WPF-based editor, they added some extensibility hooks. Now, this extensibility hooks is based upon something that's called MEF, or the Managed what does MEF stand for? Manage Execution Framework? Extensibility. That's the name of my talk. You'd think I'd be able to remember that. Wow, I really did need more caffeine this morning. So MEF, that's the whole thing with, acronyms you can pronounce, right? You actually forget what they mean, right? Managed Extensibility Framework allows sort of, again, a new level of simplified extensibility. Now, in future versions of Visual Studio, from what I've been told, I haven't seen any future versions, this will be more prevalent, right? And in fact, some of the tooling in Visual Studio today uses MEF more extensively than the whole Visual Studio IDE. The only place that the IDE uses it is in the text editor. The SharePoint project system. Anybody do SharePoint development? A couple people, so you care. The SharePoint project system is super extensible via MEF, right? And in fact, just to show you a flavor of that, I'll show you an example that I built a little bit later. It will give you kind of the flavor for what may be to come in future versions as more of the project systems in Visual Studio and more of the underlying infrastructure becomes MEFified, so to speak. Okay? See, I haven't even had it on a slide, right? Managed Extensibility Framework. So what is the Managed Extensibility Framework? Why do we care? It's a framework for building extensible, pluggable apps. You can always do this in .NET. I've been teaching .NET since the very first betas were public. I've been teaching people how to do this for that many years, which is, I think, almost 10 years now. So you could always do this by doing dynamic loading of assemblies and then basically dynamically creating objects and plugging objects into your system. There's a couple of different ways to build applications, right? One way to build an application is I have an application. It uses 5 different components, and my application references all 5. So there's a hard .NET reference to all of the assemblies that my application needs, which is a fine way to build an application. Other people want more flexibility and more extensibility in their application. They want a little bit more loose coupling. So instead of the 5 assemblies, such an application might really reference one assembly at the .NET level. That one assembly would have some base class definitions or interface definitions. The application then could dynamically load the other assemblies, either through convention or through configuration. Either statically or dynamically figure out what objects to create those objects, and plug them into the application. Very common usage for this is if you have a Windows application, whether it's Windows Forms or WPF, to have the commands or your menu system dynamically built this way. That is, you don't hard code what's on the file menu. You let the components that are composed at runtime determine what commands go on the file menu. A lot of people build applications this way, or certain applications this way. So, the Visual Studio team could have said, hey, let's build something that does that for this next version in order to create a better extensibility story. Because as I said, one of the problems with extensibility in earlier versions was how do I make sure that Visual Studio loads my assembly and loads all the assemblies that my assembly is dependent on. If you put them in your own directory, then sometimes it didn't work. If you put it in the public assembly directory, in the Visual Studio directory, it would work, but then that felt kind of wrong. So there was lots of issues with loading those assemblies. And the Visual Studio team could have said, hey, let's make up our own. Instead, luckily for us, they were already building this into the .NET framework in 4.0. So MEF is part of the .NET framework. It standardizes the way to do what I just described, which is how do I dynamically build an application from a bunch of component parts that I maybe don't know about when I build the main application. And MEF is a standardized way to do this. So the nice thing is we can use this in our own programs. The other nice thing is once we learn and understand how MEF works, we can take advantage of it in Visual Studio. and again, probably other .NET products as we move along during time, right? So MEF is, can be pretty complex, but for the most part, for most use cases, it's pretty simple. It revolves around a couple of key concepts. One is a catalog. A catalog is essentially a list of assemblies that have something to do with your MEF system. Those components that have something to do with your MEF system are .NET types, and .NET types are either going to import contracts, and a contract is either can be an interface or just a name, just a string. So we're going to have things that import contracts, and we're going to have things that export contracts. And the point of MEF is to basically take all of these puzzle pieces and fit them together at runtime to build something, right? Whatever that is obviously going to be whatever you decide, or in the case of Visual Studio, whatever Visual Studio decides. But understanding MEF is one of the key things to understanding Visual Studio 2010 extensibility. So let me show you a little bit of MEF. No, Adobe Updater, I don't really want to update you. Okay, so what I've done here is I've pre-created a project that doesn't use MEF, okay? So how does it not use MEF? Inside of this WPF application, I have the typical view model, okay? And what am I doing inside of this view model is I'm basically, doing what you could call, my own custom version of MEF. As I said, this is the code that I've been writing for 10 years. What does this code do? It goes to the current directory. It grabs all of the assemblies in the current directory. And I could have that be some other directory if I wanted. It loops through those assemblies, loads them. It looks for a particular type inside of those assemblies, that is, any type that uses, that implements a particular interface. So this interface that I've called iDoSomething, right? So iDoSomething is sort of the linchpin of my extensibility system here, right? It's an interface definition. Multiple types can implement the iDoSomething interface. And what I'm going to do is, with all those different components, I'm going to build a WPF application. WPF application is going to have some buttons on it. And when somebody clicks a button, which will be me, it'll call the execute method. And whatever that component wants to do in the execute method, that's what's going to happen. So again, the point of my demo is not to show you necessarily the best way to write a MEF application. It's just to give you a flavor of how this works, okay? So let's go back to here for just one second. So after it finds any types in that assembly that implement that interface, it uses activator.createInstance. This is the late-bound activation, right? So we're doing late-bound activation. We're dynamically creating objects, but then we're going to cast it to the interface, so we're doing early-bound calls, right? We're not doing, reflection, right? We're using the interface of that type. So by casting it to the interface, we get this effect of a little bit of latency in creation of the objects, but we get this nice extensibility system, so that's our trade-off, okay? So let me run this application. I'll do Control F5. Okay, so there's my component, right? Inside of this interface definition, I have created a class that implements iDoSomething. The name of it I've given as 1. And then when I click execute, or call execute, it's going to show a message box, right? And so here it is. Exciting, huh? A message box in the morning. Very exciting. What's interesting about this application is not so much the message box, but how I can extend it. So I'm going to extend it actually by going to Notepad, or notepad.net if you like. And inside of Notepad, I've got a number 2. Oops, actually that's a little bit early. Let's take that out. Whoops. So I've got a second implementation. So my second implementation is number 2, and it's going to show a message box with a slightly different message, okay? So let me go ahead and build that. And I actually already did this once on the command line, so I won't bother to type it all in from the beginning. But actually, let me show you the directory first. So here's the directory. This is where my executable is. This is where my interface definition and my first implementation lives inside of the interface def.dll. And now, because I compiled that C# file into another DLL, I've got test.dll, right? Just to prove to you that there's nothing up my sleeve, right? There it is without test.dll. I go back up, rerun the C# compiler on the command line. Now I've got the second DLL, right? So what's going to happen when I run the program? I get 1 and 2, right? If I delete test.dll and I run the program, I get 1, right? So that makes sense how my program is essentially dynamically building itself based upon what components are available, happens to be in that directory, and it's doing it manually, right? It's doing it without meth. It's doing it in a custom way, right? Make sense? Make sense? Cool. I like it to make sense. Let's do it with meth. So to make this work with meth, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a reference to the meth assembly. I happen to have already used it recently. So the meth assembly is system.componentmodel.composition. That contains the whole meth runtime. I'm going to go ahead and add a reference to that in my interface definition. I'm going to go ahead and add a reference to that in my executable program. Okay? And then I'm going to change one thing here. Instead of just having the regular class, I'm going to annotate it so that meth knows that this component is a export. And the way I do that is by adding the export attribute and then specifying what my contract is. In this case, it's going to be I do something. Okay? So adding this attribute tells meth, okay, this thing is something that we should care about. When meth looks at this assembly, it's going to say, oh, look, there's an export. I know something about this system. Let's look for an import, right? Let's look for somewhere to import it. The place I'm going to import it is back over here in my main view model. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down here and comment that code out. And inside of my main view model, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new property, which is going to be a list of I do somethings. I'll call this raw components. Okay? And I'm going to annotate this property with an import. Actually, the one I'm going to use is import many. Okay? So that says, hey, however many of these exports you can find in the current execution context, please give them to me. I would like them, please. Okay? So now, instead of doing this, looping through assemblies and stuff like that, I can do this, which is I can say, I would like a catalog, please, meth. The catalog I'm going to pick is called the directory catalog. I'm going to specify environment.currentDirectory for my directory, but I could specify other directories if I wanted. Then I'm going to create what's called a composition container. And I'm going to give the composition container my catalog. I can have multiple catalogs. You can have assembly catalogs. You can have directory catalogs. You can build your own catalogs. The whole meth system, of course, is also extensible. And then I'm going to make a simple call to component.satisfyImports this. Okay? Now, there's many ways to use meth. This has invalid arguments. Really? Oh, there's a, that's an extension method that I need system.componentModel.composition. Extension methods are great, right? But if you haven't added the right using statement, of course, they don't work. So satisfy imports once is a method on the composite container, but it's also an extension method for simplicity. They added into the main namespace, so you can basically pass any object in. So So I'm going to pass in myself, this, and then after that's done, I'm just going to do a for each on this dot raw components, and I'm going to do a little copy and paste inheritance. Let's go back up here, and for each of these items, I'm essentially going to add a new one of my view models, right? So I'm doing the whole, model view model thing, but the underlying components are just raw.NET components, and I'm building it up using Meth. Okay? Make sense? I need to see at least 2 heads nod yes before I continue. That's about 10. Cool. I like that. All right, so what's going to happen now? Well, when I run this, let's debug it. What did I do wrong? Well, that's helpful. Let me go back and look this over. I've got import many, right? Here, I've got export. Let me do a clean and a rebuild. Whoa. Any pair programmers out there can tell me what I did wrong? I'm sorry? Oh, no. The raw components list will get created by Meth if there is any components there. It may be that I have, I don't have test.dll in there. Well, that's the beauty of demos, which is if I open up Visual Studio, I can say File Open Project and go to Complete. Julie Childs. To me, this looks pretty much exactly the same. Oh, hang on. No? I did composition container, satisfy imports once. Boy, it sure looks the same to me. Let's try this version. Something wrong, right? Some line of code I wrote wrong. This is the same project, and I methified it right before the session. So essentially, here is my import many, right? Here is my export, right? And if I run this, I get the same effect, same app. The difference is I'm using Meth. Now, off of Visual Studio, right, what we're talking about here is this is how Visual Studio does extensibility now. The idea is you're going to package up your components as Meth components that export one or more known interfaces to Visual Studio. Visual Studio is going to dynamically load you, figure out what you're exporting, and essentially compose Visual Studio from these component parts. Right? Visual Studio is exactly the kind of application in which you might want to have such a system. In earlier versions of Visual Studio, the way that you did that, the way that you sort of registered your quote-unquote part to be a component inside of the Visual Studio system was pretty much by putting stuff in the registry. Right? You put stuff in the registry, or you put stuff in special folders, and Visual Studio looked for special metadata files for add-ins, and it looked in the registry for packages, and based upon what those registry entries were or the metadata files were, it loaded your component, and it created an instance of it, and it cast it to the interface. This is just a simplification of that system, right? The simplification means that in Visual Studio 2010 and going forward, there's going to be a much simplified way to package up a component, which just means I basically just have to give a DLL to Visual Studio and say, hey, here's a Meth component. Visual Studio says, oh, cool, I know about Meth, loads Meth, looks for the exports in your component, and says, oh, look, I can match those up with somebody who wants that, imports, and you've got a composite application, right? An application that's built from component parts that don't know anything about each other except for interface, right? Make sense? Yeah? Cool. Okay, so let me go back to the slides for just a minute. By the way, that was me who did the demo. If you were wondering, all the demo slides have name and title and group. I did the demo, so in case you were wondering. So MEF plus V6 packaging is what makes Visual Studio Extensibility from 2010 going forward such, it's a beautiful thing, right? I mean, I get excited about it, right? Even at 8:30 in the morning, even on the Eastern time zone, when I'm from the Western time zone, Pacific time zone, I get excited about MEF, I get excited about Visual Studio Extensibility, I get excited about V6. V6 is the name of the packaging that allows you to create a zip file. It's basically an open packaging convention file. It's a zip file that has some metadata files in it, and the metadata files tell Visual Studio what kind of stuff that you have in it. The main thing that you can put in it is this thing called extension.vsx manifest. The extension.vsx manifest is an XML file. Yeah, there's still some metadata, but it's standardized XML. You don't have to build stuff to go in the registry. There's one XML file. It has a designer. And you add your metadata into that file. You package up your components as a zip. There's a Visual Studio project that will do this for you. If you download the Visual Studio SDK, which if you're interested in doing this stuff, you may have already done, there's a project template for creating a V6 package. Once you create a V6 package, you can take that thing, upload it to the gallery, which I'll show you how to get to the gallery if you haven't been there. You can pass it around to your team, upload it to your team's SharePoint site, have everybody download it, and everybody's got the same environment, the same extensibility that you've built on your machine. So inside of the support files, this can be DLLs. It can also be project templates and item templates. This is another sort of very exciting piece of extensibility in Visual Studio 2010, which is we've always had the ability to package up templates and pass them around, but in order to get them to work, again, on somebody else's machine, you had to make sure that people put those templates in the right directories. With V6, you can actually package up a template, a project template or an item template. Again, put it in the V6 file, give everybody the V6 file, boom, everybody's got the template, right? Easy template sharing, again, on your team, in your company, or to the world, right, through the online gallery. So to create a V6, all you have to do is download the SDK, create a new extensibility project type. There's a number of them, and I'll walk through what they are. Basically, configure the VS manifest, which is an XML file. You can type the XML in by hand, or you can use the designer. Either way, what happens is when you do a build, the project system that Visual Studio SDK installs, which is a package, right? Everything's a package, builds the V6 file for you, and there you go, you're done. How do you install these things? You double-click on them, right? If you pass them around, you double-click on the V6 file, it opens up the Visual Studio installer. You follow the agree to the license or whatever other things that are in that file, and it's installed. It goes into a folder in your app data directory. That's useful to know just to make sure when you're trying to build one of these, to make sure all your files are in there and everything, so you can sometimes go and look at those. Also, under Tools, there's Extension Manager, so this makes it really easy to remove extensions or go to the online gallery and see what extensions are out there. Okay? I'm going to go back over to my demo machine. Let's take a look at this. So I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to go to Extensions Manager, right? So Extensions Manager is the V6 installer component built into Visual Studio. So Tools, Extension Manager, that's going to bring up what are the V6 extensions that I have installed. I have one that I built for a demo. I have the Entity Designer Database Generator. I have NuGet Package Manager. How many people are using NuGet? Yeah, if you haven't looked at NuGet, you should really look at it. It's a great way to be able to easily get commonly used packages, both from Microsoft and from the community, that you might want to use, right? For example, in this project, what's a pattern that I might want to use? Well, I'm doing model view model, And I might want to do something with a pattern called service locator. Service locator is just a pattern that a lot of people use to say, hey, you know, I need a service, maybe my data repository. I need a service, maybe I need a file system service. And the reason people like the service locator pattern is because it's sort of a MEF kind of thing, right? In fact, you can implement a service locator really nicely using MEF, as an aside. But the idea is you create a layer of abstraction with interfaces, and that makes it easier to do unit testing, because it's easy to mock what services your application might want. So how could I bring that in? Well, if I went here, I could right-click and say Add Library Package Reference, which unless you've installed NuGet, you don't have that command, right? So one of the things that NuGet installs is, you know, menu items. If I do Add Library Package Reference, I can go online, and I can say, how about Service Locator? There's the common service locator. That's from Microsoft. It's from Patterns and Practices. I'm going to say Install. Great. What does that do for me? Well, that basically adds the right references to my project. And inside of my solution folder, it adds packages. So it basically means that, you know, the DLLs and everything are right here inside of my project. So I don't have to worry about, you know, oh, I've downloaded and installed the service locator pattern assembly from Patterns and Practices. It's somewhere on my file system. When I reference that, this is one of the big pains with adding packages and references in team development is, if I took that, you know, and just added a raw reference to it and then checked it into source control, when my partner Brian Randall downloads it, and I know because I've done this, you know, a million times, he downloads it, he can't build it. Why can't he build it? Because the assemblies aren't there, right? But this way, I've got my assemblies all in that same directory. I can check that into source control, and I can let NuGet essentially manage the packages, and I've got a great way of bringing stuff in. NuGet is built as a v6 package. NuGet uses MEF extensively, in fact, to build itself, right, and to, you know, build different components into NuGet from component parts. So this is just another example of potential Visual Studio extensibility using MEF and using v6, right? It makes everything a lot easier, right? The guys who built NuGet probably could not have built NuGet at least as quickly or as easily if they hadn't had v6 and MEF, right? So this is an example of something that Microsoft has done. It's sort of a macro project, but you can start to think about micro projects that you might do that might be useful to you, okay? All right, so that's tools, right? Tools Extension Manager lets me, oh, I just showed you the ones I have installed. Let's go to the online gallery. So if I go to the online gallery, right, this isn't just NuGet, although the dialog looks the same. This is a list of all of the v6, all of the packages that have been uploaded to the gallery. Now, some of these aren't v6. Some of these are actually MSIs that you have to go down and install. But many of them are v6. The NuGet Package Manager is one. And so to install these, you just basically just have to say, you know, download, I would like to install this, right? CSS3 IntelliSense schema, right? So a number of these, there's the SDK, cool. I would have liked to have downloaded it that way. So you can see some of these are from Microsoft, some of these are from third parties, some of these are from companies, but this ecosystem now is possible only because of a common packaging format, right? Obviously, we had a common install format in earlier versions of Visual Studio, which was an MSI, right? But, you know, again, without this common packaging format, it would not be very easy to build this kind of extensibility system into Visual Studio 2010. And without MEF, it really wouldn't be possible to build it in a standardized way, right? So it's really those two things combined. MEF as the underlying component builder, right, and composition engine. V6 as the packaging engine that makes Visual Studio extensibility in 2010 that much more accessible, right? Again, the whole idea here is, in this version, there is very little that is sort of new and different in terms of extensibility, although there is some things, and I'll show you that. it's mostly the same thing, right? Add-ins, macros, packages, right? But it's V6 and MEF that really make it accessible and easy, okay? So let's go back and just talk about extensibility for just 1 second, because there were some things I wanted to show you. If you haven't used macros, macros, of course, are really very, very useful. If you go to the Macro Explorer, you can see samples, as well as I can see macros that I have. Here's one macro that I use a lot. Let me open up the macro editor. I've got this little macro here. What does it do? It calls system.gc.collect. Why do I have that macro? Well, you know, garbage collection isn't going to kick in until I really run out of memory. And I like to run lots of different versions, instances of Visual Studio at the same time. I've got, 4 open? And look, they're all using, you know, a fair amount of my resources. I've got a nice machine. I've got 8 gigabytes of RAM, but periodically, you know, I start to get really close to the top. I'm only at 5 right now. So that little macro, run it. Notice that now I only have 3 of those Visual Studio instances that are up there at the top. That one went down to 41 megabytes, right? So that's an example of a very simple kind of thing, and that's what macros are for, right? Macros are for sort of simple or one-off little things. You write them in VBA. They're built into your Visual Studio system. You can add them as buttons and commands. And again, this is sort of the lowest level of extensibility. From there, we go to add-ins. Add-ins, again, are sort of the thing that people built a lot when they wanted to build a package but didn't want to take the time to build a package. Add-ins were sort of the intermediate step between macros and packages. Because packages are so easy to build now, I think add-ins are a lot less useful. Packages just have more raw power inside of the Visual Studio system, and add-ins sort of get they get an object model that is layered on top of the real object model. Add-ins are kind of like macros that you can write in C# or VB.NET, right? They have the same sort of power as macros, but they can be packaged up and reused. Packages, you get the sort of raw, low-level system part of Visual Studio. So how do I create one of these things, whatever I want to create? I go to New Project, and I go to Extensibility. And these are the projects that are built in once I install the Visual Studio SDK. Here's Visual Studio Package, right? So this will create a project that's a C# Visual Studio Package project that packages up that assembly as a V6 project, so you can build a package very, very easily, package it up as a V6, and deploy it to everybody. Why would you create a package? Well, I mean, again, NuGet, right? NuGet is a package, and the reason that they need a package is because they want to add menu items to the right click on the project nodes and the solution nodes. Those kinds of sort of more integrated kind of extensibility features are really exposed at the package level. Again, packages, as I said before, never really that fun to build. Some of that has not changed because some of the same interfaces are still there. But in terms of building one, it's actually much easier to build one because there's a project template, and because the project template builds a V6, and then you can install the V6. Actually, for fun, let's just create one of these. I'm going to create a new package. I'm going to build it in C#. I want to generate a new key file. Company name is going to be MCW. Package name will be VS Extensibility Rocks. Caps lock is off. Information about my, I would like to have a menu command and a tool window and a custom editor. Sure, I want all of those things. I don't want that. Finish. So this is going to create a project that allows me to build a Visual Studio template. Okay? It's got an editor, it's got a tool window, it's got all that stuff built in. Let's see, here's the package. So the package here is a class that implements a base class called package, which actually implements an interface. Here's all these attributes. These attributes are what you do now instead of creating a registry file. Basically, when I do a build, let's just do a build on this. And I'm going to go ahead and open in Windows Explorer. I'm going to go to bin debug. There's my v6, right? So what it did was it created a few files. It compiled the assembly. It dropped in the extension.v6 manifest, which I'll go back and show you in a second. It's got this thing called the package def file. That's the registry entries. Rather than having everybody's package go into the main registry hive, what they do in this version of Visual Studio is when you load Visual Studio, they copy everything from the 10.0 hive into another hive that they call 10.0_config something, depending on how many extensions you're working with differently in different instances. You might have multiples of these. But basically what it does is it builds that registry entry dynamically when you start Visual Studio. And so this is how it does the old style plus new style, right? The old style still has a little bit of registry magic, but the registry magic is taken care of for you because when you build a package, it builds the package def file. The package def file contains all the registry entries. That goes in with your v6. That gets installed when you install your v6, and Visual Studio magically pulls that package def into the right hive for that particular executable run of Visual Studio. What's in the v6 file? Let me rename it to .zip. So as I said, v6 file is just a zip file. It contains all of those files. Right? Templates is where if I had item templates or project templates, those would go in. So it's got my assembly. It's got the package def file, which is the magic registry file. It's got the manifest, which is the metadata. And then it's got content types.xml, which is the standard OPC metadata file that says, here's what's inside of this OPC file format. How do I install this? Let's go right-click and rename it back to its real file name so that Visual Studio recognizes it. v6. Yes. Double-click on it. Do you want to install this? I could have added a license. I can decide what versions of Visual Studio it should go with, and I say install. Hey, cool, it's installed. If I open up a new version of Visual Studio, but I had it right there. If I go to Tools, Extension Manager, there's my VS package, right? It was installed today. And if I want to get rid of it, I can just say uninstall. I can just get rid of it, right? Again, where does it go? It goes into your app directory. So if I go to C, users, John, app data, local, Microsoft, Visual Studio, 10.0, extensions. There's my MCW folder, sorry. Here's the Microsoft folder, here's the MCW folder, here's my package, here's 1.0 version of my package, and here are all those files, right? So the v6 packaging doesn't do anything super complicated. All it does is pops up that dialog, says, here's the license, drops all the files that are inside of the zip file into a special directory, and you can imagine, based upon my code, what Visual Studio does in terms of MEF, right? What Visual Studio does in terms of MEF is it says, hey, I want a new directory catalog. Let's do a directory catalog starting at C, John, App Data, Local, Microsoft, Visual Studio 10.0 extensions. Let's load every DLL that's inside of that directory or any subdirectory, and then let's compose Visual Studio of all those components, right? Also including the built-in ones, right? And the Microsoft ones, which are built into the Visual Studio directory. This is where third-party extensions go, right? Not Microsoft extensions, but third-party extensions or extensions that you build, okay? So that was, you know, a 30-second demo overall, if you take out my blabbing, to create a package and install a package. And I already have it ready to send to other people's machines, right? If I want to give it to somebody on my team, like, again, Brian, my colleague Brian, I could just check the v6 into source control, or I could email it to him. He double-clicks on it, it installs, boom, he's got the same package right now, right away. No muss, no fuss, no MSIs, right? No writing to the registry, none of that stuff. And again, as we move forward to new versions of Visual Studio, this is the system that they're going to be building on, and it's just going to get easier and easier, and there's going to be more and more functionality that you'll be able to take advantage of. Okay? Any questions right now? Yes, sir. Correct. This is a .NET Framework 4 project because Visual Studio is built with .NET Framework 4. Well, you can build .NET 3.5 projects with Visual Studio, but if you build Extensibility, you'll be building it in .NET 4. But your projects can still be .NET 3.5 and .NET 2.0, right? Because Visual Studio 2010 has the multi-targeting. Okay, let me show you a couple other examples of things you can do. Here's the sort of canonical demo that people do. I'm going to say I want a new project. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the pieces of Visual Studio that is now methified is the editor. Okay? Let me go back to the editor for just a second. So the editor, of course, is WPF. If you haven't done this, this is the fun thing to do. Ooh. Ah. Ooh. Ah. Right? That's zooming in and zooming out. Look how pretty those fonts are, right? WPF. So this is a brand new editor. All the text editors in Visual Studio 2010 use the same underlying WPF text editor component. So this was the little swath of Visual Studio that they said, okay, if we're going to pick one part of Visual Studio for 2010 to bring to the new world, what's it going to be? And they decided it was the text editor. Other parts of Visual Studio will be brought to the new world, and what I mean by the new world, again, is MEF plus V6, right? MEF plus V6 is the new world. Registry and all that stuff is the old world. Again, just to be clear, the V6 system right now can bridge that gap, again, with that package def file. The package def file is the registry file that'll get installed into that registry hive when you install your extension. So you can still bridge the old world, right? But the new world is pure MEF goodness. So they MEFified this. And what I mean by that is when I say File, New Project, and I pick Extensibility, I get a few extra project templates, okay? Editor classifier, editor margin, editor text adornment, and editor viewpoint adornment, okay? So editor margin allows me to basically have a WPF component that plugs into all text files or certain text files. Editor classifier allows me to do things in terms of highlighting text. Editor adornment allows me to do things like IntelliSense and all that kind of stuff is implemented using that. And viewpoint adornment allows me basically to drop a component somewhere on the page sort of randomly, okay? So editor margin, the template creates a bare bone editor margin that places a green box across the bottom of the editor's viewport. Okay, not super exciting. So in preparation for this talk, I thought, what would be a actual useful editor margin? The one that I've seen most other people build, I think I saw Scott Gu build one at the Visual Studio launch, which was like a Twitter, right? It showed Twitter tweets right in the bottom, and I thought, well, Twitter's so 2010, right? How about something more useful rather than fun? So I came up with this idea of, I love to use OneNote. How many people use OneNote? Good, a good number of you. OneNote is, for those of you that don't use it, is part of Office. So if you have Office, you have OneNote, and it's a great place to take just unorganized notes. I use it for meetings. Every time I have a meeting, I want to keep notes. I say in Outlook, hey, create a OneNote note for me, and I type in notes from the meeting. And I can associate it with documents, and I can just put in raw, to-dos and, wild ideas that I have for Visual Studio Extensibility and things like that. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if, while I'm in Visual Studio, I could just create notes relating to a particular source file, just, random notes, right? Just stuff I don't want to put in comments necessarily, just notes for myself about what I want to do to this file. Wouldn't that be kind of cool? So I built this over the last couple days. So this is the same project type that I just showed you. I said I want a new editor margin, and I did a little bit of work with WPF, and I did a little bit of work with the OneNote API, and what I came up with was this little UI that shows up at the bottom of my code files that allows me to write notes into OneNote. Now, if you noticed, when I'm in a regular Visual Studio instance, I have no margin. I have no component. And that's because I haven't actually installed the v6 yet. I showed you how easy it was to build a package and install it. Of course, I haven't written any code for that v6, for that package. I haven't debugged it yet. I haven't made sure that it actually works. So installing it on your machine isn't usually the first thing you do. The first thing you want to do is you actually want to test it. And the way you can test any of those v6 projects is by debugging or starting without debugging. And what the Visual Studio project system does is it starts an experimental instance of Visual Studio. If we go back to the registry, notice that there is a 10.0 EXP and a 10.0 EXP config. So what happens is it basically dynamically creates a new hive in the registry that allows you to open up an instance of Visual Studio that has a whole bunch of different settings than the one you use to develop. And so this is the way you want to develop when you're using v6 and packages and the like. Notice this says experimental instance, okay? And so now when I open up, let's say, a console application, right? Notice I have a little editor margin down here in the bottom. And it says a little mef in the morning. A little mef in the morning is a good way to start the day. Okay? And if I close this and open it up, notice that it's still there. There's the little viewport adornment, if you're wondering. That's also installed in my experimental instance. So that's a little purple box you could do things with. If I close that instance of Visual Studio, we go back over to that instance of Visual Studio, that's the project. I'll say start without debugging again. I'll open up, and there's the text still there. So basically what it's doing, it's creating a connection between my file. Oh, I should also do another file, right? Let's do another file. Well, actually, let's go to OneNote first. Right? And so there's my note, right? I've basically created the title is the name of the file so I can find it again, and then I can just write random notes in. I could add, more functionality so that I could use, more of the things that are in OneNote, like to-do lists and things like that. But, this was just a basic sort of proof of concept, getting it up and running. But so that would be an example of, the kind of extensibility you could do. Overall, it took me about, I would say it took me about 4 hours to build this. 3 of those 4 hours was figuring out how to work with the OneNote API. Because the OneNote API is not like other Office APIs. Other Office APIs are sort of very straightforward, like do this, do that. Right? They're all COM and stuff, so they have all the ref arguments and optional arguments. The OneNote API is sort of this weird mix between a real API and just raw XML. So you kind of have to work with the API, but then to really do anything, you have to work with the raw XML. So it took me 3 hours to figure out what the XML should look like. So that was actually the hardest part of this project. Right? The hardest part of the project was doing the actual functionality, not the plug-in to Visual Studio, which is the whole point, right? The whole point of MEF plus V6. This is one example. Again, not all of Visual Studio has been MEFified yet. The only part of main Visual Studio that's been MEFified is the editor. But this is the direction that they're going, and in the next version, I imagine, again, I'm just speculating based upon what I've been told in the past, there will be even more of this. But again, even in this version, in Visual Studio 2010, you can tackle things like the package and build one of those and not have to go buy my book from 2003 and read the chapter on VSIP and read through. Here's this interface. This is what this interface does. And here's that interface. This is what that interface does. And oh, by the way, if you actually want to get this to work, you have to drop your DLL in a special directory, and you have to add all these registry entries. And by the way, you'll have to build an MSI. And of course, once you get it to work on your machine, figuring out everything you did to your machine to make it work in another machine. Again, that's gone, even for old-style extensibility in terms of things like packages, right? And even simple things like item templates and project templates, right? If I go back to Visual Studio over here for a second and say new project, the other project templates, I may have pointed this out, but I want to point it out again. C# item template and C# project template. So what do these do? Well, what these do is these create a V6, and the V6 allows you to install essentially a project template or an item template. Oh, here's the VS template file. Sorry, that's not the right thing. New project. Let me go back. Actually, let me go back over to this one. One thing I promised to show you and I have not shown you is the VSIX manifest file. So this is the manifest designer. So the manifest designer, I can put in license terms, I can put in an icon, a preview image, more info URL. I can go down here and add components. Notice that they've already added a MEF component for me, which is my component. I can add multiple MEF components. I looked at the NuGet manifest last night, and they have like 10 MEF components inside of NuGet, right? So to get more functionality like that, you're going to have more components. But again, the packaging is exactly the same. And if you prefer to edit XML, you can always right-click and say Open With, and open it with the XML editor, right? And it's just a very simple XML file that at runtime gets built into the manifest file that goes into the V6, right? Okay. Other questions? No? All right, let me show you something else then. We've got a few more minutes. So here is a piece of extensibility that I built for the SharePoint project system. It actually uses both Visual Studio extensibility and SharePoint extensibility. So I'll show you both parts. One part of this is essentially a package, right? So I've got a package here, which is a Visual Studio package, which again is sort of the main raw low-level extensibility of Visual Studio. What happens is when my initialize method gets called, when this package gets loaded, I essentially get access to the Visual Studio environment, okay? And you can do whatever you want to do. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm registering something called an editor factory. So what I'm creating is I'm creating an editor that's going to plug into Visual Studio. The code inside of this method is pretty much exactly the same as the code inside of the V6 editor, right? I just showed you the V6 editor. So this has nothing to do with SharePoint at this moment, right? I see people leaving because I mentioned the word SharePoint. Don't get scared. This is pure Visual Studio extensibility. This is me being able to create a new editor and register a new editor. That is a visual designer for some file type, okay? So WPF, right? I've got a WPF editor, okay? So the question is, my WPF editor, how do I get it loaded, right? How would I get it loaded? Well, what I'd like to have for my editor is I would like to be able to be like the V6, right? And basically say, hey, I'd like to be registered for a particular file type. The problem is that the files that I want to edit in this case are XML. And when you register an editor for XML files in Visual Studio, you can either register for a particular file extension, like VSIX manifest, or you can register for .xml. Of course, if you register for .xml, then you override the built-in XML editor, which is not what I want. The second option is to register for a particular root element name and namespace URI, which unfortunately doesn't work in my case either, because for this particular project type, every single XML file has the same root element and the same namespace URI, even those ones that I don't want to design, okay? So this was sort of a quandary in the design of this component was, how am I going to do this? So what I decided to do is to add a right-click to a file that I recognize not only the root element name and namespace, but then the next element, right? With the next element will actually work for me. Visual Studio doesn't do that for me, so I have to figure that out on my own. But then the issue becomes, how do I get a menu item on a right click on a project item? And this is where the old world meets the new world, okay? In the old world, if you built a package and you wanted to get a menu item on a right click on a solution or a project and a project item, you had to write a lot of code, and then you had to create a special file called it's a CTC file or CTC somewhere in the file extension, and then you had to run that through a special compiler, and then that created a bunch of special stuff that Visual Studio knew about. So that was Visual Studio's old way of allowing you to add a menu item as a right click to some part of the system, some part of the solution explorer, right? Anybody built packages ever do that? Menu item? Again, was that fun? No? You can say it was fun if you want to. I mean, we'll make fun of you, but no. So anyway, how can I do that in the new world? Well, this is the way the SharePoint project system lets me do it. This is not necessarily the way you can do it for every project in Visual Studio, but I imagine that this will be the way that you can do it in future versions of any project type. At least I hope so. And the guy who, the program manager in charge of this is a guy named Mike Morton, and he's down at the SharePoint booth. And tell him that I said, what I always say about Mike in my talks is, the stuff that they did in the SharePoint project system was awesome, just total awesome sauce. And I hope that all the project systems in the next version of Visual Studio work the same way. And I'm not saying that because I like Mike, because I actually don't like him at all. So go up to him and say, John said he doesn't like you, but he really likes your work, or something like that. So what does this do? This is using MEF, of course, right? So in order to build a plugin to the SharePoint project system, all you have to do is create a class that implements an interface and then put in an export. So when the SharePoint project system loads, and again, this is SharePoint specific, don't get scared though, because this is an indication of the future. You basically just build a .NET class that implements an interface and you say export, right? No more attributes for all the registry entries you need, no more CTC files, and inside of this project extension, in my initialize, what I'm basically doing is walking the tree of items that are in that project and saying, hey, are any of these the XML files that I'm interested in editing? If so, I'm going to add an event handler for that file's project item menu items requested. They may have picked a better word here for that API. But basically then I get a call when anybody right-clicks on that project item, and then I can add a menu item, right? So basically I add a menu item, if I take away all the other infrastructure code that I have in here, in about 10 lines of code. In about 10 lines of code with an export and a v6, I can add a menu item to a project in Visual Studio, right? Again, just to be clear, this is only the SharePoint project system right now. This is, again, sort of I'm just guessing, right? And I'm hoping that other project systems will be like this. Right now, this is pretty much the way that the editor extension is, right? In the editor extension, I basically get to create a class that implements an interface and exports itself, right? It's just that simple. Let me run this. Okay. So again, I'm going to run it in the experimental instance. I'm going to open up a SharePoint project that has an XML file. Notice that even though I have an XML file, I still have my little OneNote extension because this is a source code. It's a text file. If I wanted to, I wouldn't have to load that for every file type, so I get that choice. That's an aside. What I added was right-click, open with Designer, right? So there's my 10 lines of code. My 10 lines of code allow me to add a right-click menu item to the items in that project template that I want to. And then when I open it, right, there's my designer. This is my designer for this XML file, right? So it allows me to go in and say, hey, I want to add some fields to this particular list, right? And I can go in and add stuff and remove stuff and work with that file. Okay? So the point of it isn't to show you a list designer for SharePoint, which is what this is. The idea here is to show you the possibilities for this extensibility story. Underneath my editor, I also am using MEF to build my infrastructure. How am I using MEF? What I've done is I've implemented my own interface, and that interface basically allows any component to register itself as an editor for a particular XML type in this project system. So what I've built is not only an editor for certain XML files, I've also built the infrastructure to plug in other editors. So if somebody else wants to build an editor, all they have to do is create the plugin. They don't have to create the whole system. And in fact, that's the way NuGet works, right? NuGet, they obviously use V6 and they use MEF to get themselves loaded into Visual Studio. But then once they get loaded into Visual Studio, they also use MEF to load all of their different components. Because, of course, why wouldn't they, right? Why wouldn't they if they already have this system at hand for basically creating a pluggable environment where my application is basically composed of different components? Why wouldn't I build my plugin with plugins, right? And of course, you could do that, right? And my extension does that, NuGet does that. And so anytime you're building something bigger than a sort of one-off kind of thing, you want to think about, hey, you know, the guys who designed Visual Studio and architected it, pretty smart guys. Let's look at the way they did this. Oh, look, they used MEF and they used this, you know, basically pluggable extensibility system. Maybe we should use that too, even if you're not necessarily thinking about extensibility for what you're building. And again, in your own applications too. I mean, MEF isn't just for Visual Studio, right? Just to be clear, it's part of the .NET Framework. It's part of .NET Framework 4. If you're building .NET Framework 4 projects, you can use MEF. It's part of Silverlight 4. If you're building Silverlight projects, you can use MEF. It's part of the runtime of both the .NET Desktop CLR as well as the Silverlight CLR. Okay? All right, I have 2.5 minutes left. Any questions? Yes, sir. That's a great question. So the question is, does the V6 format support chaining? And the answer is yes. You can say, my V6 is dependent on this other V6. And so before you install yours, right, if somebody goes to the online gallery and says, I want to install that one, you can say, well, you got to install, for example, NuGet is a good example of that, right? So if you're going to build an extensible part of NuGet, right, you have to install NuGet first, and you can, in your manifest, you can declare that. Yes? Any other questions? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, can you speak louder? The mic isn't actually on. Can you turn on the mic in the back for questions? Hello. Can you turn on the mics for questions? He's going to turn it on back there, I think. Test, test. Yeah, maybe it's on now. This one's on. Here, I can give you mine. I have to stop right on time just so you guys know because they double booked me. So I have like 15 minutes or something to get up to my next room because I'm doing another talk. So I apologize. We have to end right on time. But please ask your question. So the question is about the V6 file, and what's the question? Yes? Is what? I'm sorry, I still can't hear you. Installation and uninstallation. Uninstallation is just removing everything. So, I mean, if you really need some other kind of installation and uninstallation, you can still build an MSI and have people install the MSI and uninstall the MSI. But to really take advantage of V6, uninstall is just, it just removes everything. What kind of checks for what? Right? Yeah, well, the only thing you can do in terms of the V6 is you can say, I depend on another package. You can say that, but other than that, you have to basically put all your components inside of that one folder. Yep. All right, thank you guys very much. 13 seconds, but I'm going to go ahead and end and pack up and go to my next talk. Thank you very much for coming out at 8:30, and please do an evaluation. We're interested, obviously, in your thoughts about the session. If you liked it. If you didn't like it, don't bother. No, I'm just kidding. Please, whatever your evaluation is, please do it for me. Thank you very much.